The musculoskeletal system. So the musculoskeletal system provides your actual form, the basic figure of your body. It allows you to stand upright and allows for movement. You have more than 600 muscles that attach to bone. These are also called skeletal or voluntary muscles because you actually make the decision to move or not. Skeletal muscles attach directly to bone by tough cords called tendons. There's other types of muscle outside of your skeletal muscle. You've got smooth muscle and you've got cardiac muscle. So here's kind of how all of them differ. Your cardiac muscle is just in your heart. You have skeletal muscle, which is all of your major muscle groups that allow for movement. And then your smooth muscle is going to be areas that need to stretch, such as your intestines. Here are the major muscles within the body. Yes, I realize that there are way more than what are shown here, but this is basic anatomy. Go ahead and look at this within your book and kind of start to learn where those major muscles are. I want to draw your attention to the different sides. One side of that model is superficial. You can see that annotated at the top. The other side is deep, so superficial would be closer to the surface of the skin. Deep would be underneath of that, so away from. It's the contraction and relaxation of muscles that make it possible to move around and to interact with your environment. A byproduct of movement is heat. So when you get cold, you shiver, you shake your muscles in order to produce heat. So that's another function of the muscular system. Respiratory system, these are structures of the body that contribute to ventilation, which is the actual process of breathing. Respiration is actually the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen within the body. Your airway is divided into two sections. You have your upper airway and your lower airway. Your upper airway starts at your mouth and nose, has your tongue, your jaw, your oral cavity, and then goes to your epiglottis, which is the top of your larynx. You also have your pharynx there, which is divided into three different parts. Your nasopharynx is on the top. You have your oropharynx, which is your throat, and then you have your laryngopharynx, where you've got your larynx anteriorly, so towards the front, and your esophagus posteriorly or the back. Your epiglottis is a little flap that makes sure that when you are eating food and you swallow, that it goes back into your trachea and down to your stomach rather than going forward and down into your lungs, which would make you very, very sick. Your larynx is the dividing line between the upper and lower airway. You have your Adam's apple or your thyroid cartilage that you can feel in your neck. If you swallow, that moves up and down. You have your cricoid cartilage or your cricoid ring, which lies just inferiorly to the thyroid cartilage. What you're going to mostly feel is going to be that thyroid cartilage. The lower airway, you have your trachea, which is your windpipe. It's about 5 inches long. It's semi-rigid. It doesn't create full rings. There's actually a spot in the back where your esophagus sits that is not hardened, but it is an enclosed air tube. Your trachea ends where it divides into two different portions. That area is called the carina. When it switches to the two tubes, Those are your right and left bronchi, or bronchus for singular. Then it continues to go to smaller and smaller and smaller divisions until you finally get to the bronchioles, which are the lowest portion or the smallest portion. We've already talked about all of this. Your lungs, you have two of them. They're held in place by the trachea, pulmonary ligaments, and then you have arteries and veins as well. Your lungs are divided into separate lobes. Your right lung actually has 3 lobes. I know it says 2 on the screen, but your right lung has 3. You have your upper, your middle, and your lower lobe. Your left lung has only 2, so your upper and your lower. As you get into those lobes, they each have bronchi and bronchioles. At the end, they have these groupings of little air sacs, kind of look like grapes. Those are called alveoli. Your alveoli are surrounded by a capillary bed, so a very, very thin wall blood vessel, and that's where you get oxygen exchange. So oxygen moves into the blood, carbon dioxide moves out of the blood. Your lungs are covered by a very smooth tissue called the pleura. In between the pleura and your actual lungs, there's a little bit of fluid so that as your lungs expand and contract, they don't actually rub on anything. That fluid reduces friction. You can see all the different branches. You've got your main bronchi, your smaller bronchi, and then going out to those bronchioles. In order to breathe, you have to have muscle. Your diaphragm is your primary muscle. When it contracts, it actually drops down, which pulls the bottom of your lungs with it, and it creates a vacuum, which pulls air into it. And then you also have your intercostal muscles, your abdominal muscles, and your pectoral muscles. Intercostal, costal is your ribs, inter is in between, so you have muscle in between your ribs that helps. It elevates your rib cage up and out of the way, which also helps with creating that vacuum. Your abdominal muscles, not so much for breathing in, but assist in breathing out if necessary. And then you have your pectoral muscles as well. When you go to breathe out, your diaphragm moves back to its normal position. You get a lot of pressure within your thorax, which actually forces your air out. The physiology of your respiratory system is to provide all of the tissues within your body with oxygen, which they need to survive, and then to get rid of carbon dioxide, which is kind of the waste product for all of those cells and tissues in our body. And somehow that has to get out of the body. Ventilation and respiration are 2 very separate functions, but they have to work together in order to keep you alive. Respiration, and I've already talked about this a little bit, is that exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide within the body. This is done by diffusion. So going from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, trying to balance that out. So in your lungs, you have a high concentration of oxygen and a very low concentration of carbon dioxide, and so that's where they switch. In your tissues, you have a high concentration of carbon dioxide and a low concentration of oxygen. And so your oxygen is going to want to go into those tissues. Your carbon dioxide is going to want to go out of those tissues to try and normalize that balance. Your brainstem is actually what controls your breathing. So when you have arterial blood that is too low in oxygen or too high in carbon dioxide, you're going to stimulate your breathing to fix that. Hypoxic drive is when you get low levels of oxygen, and then your body is going to start breathing more because you're hypoxic. You have a lack of oxygen. Your medulla actually initiates ventilation cycles. Ventilation is the act of moving air in and out of your lungs. So you've got two different groups within the medulla, which is actually located in your brainstem. You've got your dorsal respiratory group, which is dorsal is back, is towards the back. This actually initiates respiration and then sets your respiratory pattern. There's several different patterns of respiration that we'll learn about later. You then have your ventral respiratory group, which provides for forced inspiration and expiration as needed. You're going to bring more muscle groups into this. So if you really need to take a deep breath, you're going to feel your lungs fill a little bit more. If you're having a hard time getting air out or you need to force getting air out, again, more muscles are going to be involved. Ventilation, again, simple air movement into and out of the lungs. And you guys do have these slides, so as I'm clicking past these videos, you can watch them. You provide ventilation when you administer oxygen to a patient. There's a couple of different terms that you should know as part of this as well. Tidal volume, that's the amount of air that you move into or out of the lungs in a single breath. Your residual volume is the amount of air that remains in your lungs to keep them open. You actually don't utilize all of the air in your lungs. Even when you breathe out, you still don't breathe out 100% of the air in your lungs. Your dead space is the portion of your respiratory system that has no alveoli, nothing in it. So there's no exchange of oxygen. It's just kind of an area where air hangs out. Your minute volume is the amount of air that moves in and out of your lungs in 1 minute. And this, you take out the dead space. In order to calculate your minute volume, you have your respiratory rate times your tidal volume. And we will continue on in the next recording.